Welcome to the Politics of Information webinar series organized by the Center for Access to Information and Justice at University of Winnipeg, featuring speakers who research surveillance, data, and power in the digital age. The Center for Access to Information and Justice focuses on public interest research and the use of access to information requests in social science. Please check out the CAGE website. I want to acknowledge that University of Winnipeg is located on ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and is on the homeland of the Métis Nation. And I acknowledge that our water in Winnipeg is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. Thanks to the UW event team and the media team for working on this CAGE webinar series for 5 years now. Same format as always, we have a total of 60 or so minutes with our featured speaker, and we'll have time for a few questions. If you do have questions, you can pop them into the Q&A tab at the bottom of the page. So let me introduce today's speaker, Sarah Lamdan, who is Deputy Director at the American Library Association's Office for Intellectual Freedom. Previously, Sarah was a professor at CUNY School of Law, specializing in administrative law, data privacy, and open government law. Sarah has a master's degree in library science and legal information management, as well as a law certificate in environmental law. And notably, regarding today's talk, Sarah is author of Data Cartels, the companies that control and monopolize our information, published with Stanford University Press 2022. Sarah, thanks very much for being here. The floor is yours for your presentation.
Hi, thanks. It's great to be here. I have some slides I'll put up and I will give you an overview of my book and the topics in it, and then we can have a little conversation about it. And I want to point out, so I'm also a lawyer, and I was a law professor. Nothing I'm saying today constitutes legal advice, even though I may convey some legal information. It's nice we have the international divide of US and Canada, so there's really no question I could not be your counselor at law. It's one convenience of this whole dynamic. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let me find my slide. This should do it. And then, all right. So, as Kevin pointed out, the topic of my discussion today will be data brokers, information access, and privacy, and what all of these things have in common with academic publishing and academic librarianship and academia in general is not immediately clear, which is one of the reasons that I wrote this book. So in 2022, Stanford University Press published Data Cartels, the companies that control and monopolize our information, which was the culmination of research that I'd been doing since 2017. And there was something in 2017 that sparked my interest in the topic of data brokers. Before then, as Kevin pointed out, I had a specialty in environmental law, and I'd actually just published a book about environmental information access. So I really wasn't interested in data brokering or data privacy. But one day I was sitting in my office at City University of New York. I was a professor there and also somebody who taught legal research. So I used these research platforms called Westlaw, which is actually a Thomson Reuters product. Thomson Reuters is a Canadian company that you might be familiar with. And LexisNexis, which now I fully realize is part of a larger company called Reed Elsevier LexisNexis. You might be familiar with Elsevier as a major academic publisher. LexisNexis has a legal research platform. I'm not sure if they have a Canadian iteration of the platform, but there definitely is a legal research platform for the US that is LexisNexis. So I was working a lot with these research platforms, and somebody sent me this article. Um, the article's titled, "These are the technology firms lining up to build Trump's extreme vetting program." So these words actually, they feel kind of like an iteration of maybe what we're think things we're thinking about today. But back in 2017, we'll get in our little time machine, Trump had just been elected for his first presidency. And we had a lot of concerns around how immigration policy and immigration practices were rapidly changing in the United States. So immigration became a big issue, and it was also bound up with policing. And in the US, we have customs and or ICE, which is Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. There are immigration police. They enforce immigration laws, but they do so through policing activities. So investigating, arresting, detaining, all the things that police officers do, except for their work focuses on immigration. And before, I mean, immigration policy had long, I'm not going to pretend that these issues started in the Trump administration, but during the Trump administration, there were a lot of concerns about how the immigration policing complex would grow. And one of the things Trump said offhandedly in one of his first press conferences, or I think it was a press conference, was that he was going to direct Department of Homeland Security to build something called an extreme vetting program. And ICE took this idea and ran with it. And what they took extreme vetting to mean was that they were going to build a big technological surveillance infrastructure to surveil, track, detain, deport immigrants, right? They're like, okay, we're going to build something like what we built after 9/11 through NSA, but we're going to do that for immigrants and immigration. I don't know how familiar you are with the NSA, Edward Snowden, the Prism Project. So there were all sorts of revelations about how the United States was doing very invasive things with data in order to track people who were foreign and who were outside of the country, but also people who were inside of the country and people who were had citizenship. So they were going to duplicate a program like that. These two reporters were very savvy. And when the Department of Homeland Security had what they called an investor day or an informational day to invite potential contractors to come and learn more about the extreme vetting program so that they could become partners in these surveillance infrastructure projects, they went ahead and they did a Freedom of Information Act request and got a list of everyone who attended. And they wrote this article to kind of shame them, to throw a shot over the bow to say, hey, we see you and we see that you're interested in doing this type of immigration policing and immigration surveillance. So what I noticed in the article was that among the people who came to this industry day were something called TRSS and LNSSI. TRSS is short for Thomson Reuters Special Services, and LNSSI is short for LexisNexis Special Services. That was concerning to me because one of my main jobs was to use Thomson Reuters Westlaw and LexisNexis's legal platform. So immediately I was really concerned about kind of the ethics of what the company was doing. And more importantly, I didn't understand what these companies were doing. I didn't see how a legal research company could get involved with building surveillance infrastructure. I was like, what are they going to do? They're going to give like court cases, court opinions, or statute links. Like Department of Homeland Security already has plenty of licenses to access, Westlaw and LexisNexis. All government agencies do. That's how they access the law in the United States. So I didn't understand what they were there for. So a colleague and I asked that question. We said, hey, we just know we saw this and we're concerned and confused about what Westlaw and LexisNexis have to do with ICE's extreme vetting program. And we wrote a blog post for the American Association of Law Libraries because we were members of American Association of Law Libraries, and that's the place where legal information professionals in the United States get together to discuss things, right? That's our professional organization. So we sent the blog post to our friend Jamie, who posted it on the research and instructional subgroups website, right? Like every association has a million committees. We put it on our little committee's website. And within 2 minutes of the blog post going up, it was taken down and it was replaced with this sentence. It says, this post has been removed on the advice of the American Association of Law Libraries General Counsel. And we were like, what? What? That was really confusing to us because librarians are usually the vanguard against censorship. We felt like we were being censored and we didn't understand why we wouldn't be allowed to ask that question in our professional organization's blog. So after that, I became very curious because I didn't get any answers to to the concerns that we had in questions. And to me, this just kind of highlighted to me that something maybe was fishy, that they didn't like this. Somebody didn't want us to have this discussion. Somebody didn't want us to ask about ICE extreme vetting and these companies. So I started digging around. And the more I found, what I thought would happen is that I would figure out, I would figure something out. I'm a researcher, right? I'm a library person. I would figure something out that would satisfy me and I would go on with my life. But what actually happened is the more I learned, the more concerned I got. I got really curious about these companies that I'd always known as research companies, right? I always thought, oh, well, what these companies do is provide research platforms for lawyers, for academics, like scientists. I thought these are research companies, right? They're our friends. They're like libraries' friends. We'd always had really great vendor relations. We always had like these people who represented Thomson Reuters and LexisNexis that would come to our schools and they'd like, they'd bring donuts and pens and they like they help American Association of Law Libraries. They like sponsor our annual conferences. So I always thought of them as organizations that helped us do our job. And I learned that in some regards, sure, they are. Those representatives aren't pretend people, they're real. And they really do fund a lot of library stuff and they really do sell us a lot of library products. But I learned that that is not at all the only thing they do. And I would venture to say that nowadays, it might not even be their central focus. So I will unpack all of this now. So here's what I found. I found that these companies originally did a lot of work in traditional publishing, right? Especially like Thomson Reuters. West Publishing was purchased by Thomson Reuters at some point, but really like that's a print business. They published case law in the United States. And then LexisNexis published statutes, right? They published our legal codes and they did that in paper. And we would buy volumes of their books and we put, like when you see a law library, like with the beautiful, mahogany shelves with the uniform looking books. That used to be the business of West Publishing, Westlaw, and LexisNexis. And that was a traditional publishing business. But what I found was that in the years since the internet, was invented and those publications kind of went on first, CD-ROMs. Well, first they went on like terminals that you could get in your library, but then they went on CD-ROMs. But then we invented, a much more flexible and viable internet system. So then they built these online research platforms, and that started opening new venues of information access, information research. And so they kind of branched off and started doing some data analytics work. And these companies, I found out, were uniquely positioned to do a lot of things. Hold on, I don't want to. I'll explain their particular model in a moment, but first I'll demonstrate really quickly that what they did by switching from their traditional publishing business to data analytics is not unusual. Every industry is going into data analytics, right? Um, like here are some examples of things that are now data analytics products that never were before. One of them, oh, I'm not wearing mine, but like a smartwatch, right? Like we used to have watches that were not connected to the internet and did not collect data about us. Now, these wearables that we have do collect data about us, and they are kind of their data analytic, they collect data and then they use that data for analytics, and then they, build up whole, algorithms to sift through the data, right? So their data analytics product now, thermometers, right? Nowadays, you can use particular thermometers that are connected to the internet and they can crowdsource where the flu is raging and maybe where it's waning. Your car. So that was a huge revelation in the United States last year or the year before. Our cars now, they collect data about us, and then that data is actually sold to insurance companies to assess our insurance premiums. LexisNexis is involved in that. Your refrigerator, your coffee maker, anything that is internet connected in your home, your thermostat, all of it. Those are all, conduits for data that then go into some sort of either data brokering product, some sort of data analytics product, or both. Um, and here is how our traditional publishers kind of started advertising themselves. So read Elsevier, LexisNexis, which remember, Elsevier is one of the oldest academic journal companies, if not the oldest. It might be the first academic journaling companies, like the Compendium of Science, um, in the world, right? Darwin put his findings in an Elsevier publication. Um, it is very storied, traditional, old, but now it is part of a larger company called Reed Elsevier LexisNexis. Reed started as a news publishing company, and all of these companies kind of coalesced, right? They all consolidated into this big information company called Reed Elsevier LexisNexis. And now that company doesn't call itself a publisher. It calls itself the provider of information-based analytics and decision tools for professionals and business company customers, enabling them to make better decisions, get better results, and be more productive. You might think of Elsevier as a publisher, but this is the way Reed Elsevier LexisNexis describes itself. Similarly, Clarivate, which is ProQuest, if you're a librarian, that might ring a bell. Um, and Web of Science is a Clarivate product. They call themselves a data insights and analytic company for innovation. Westlaw, Thomson Reuters, their legal product sells what they call litigation analytics, actionable data to improve your legal strategy. And Bloomberg, which is a big financial information company, um, I like this little um, tagline, face the data, change the world. These companies all market themselves and behave like data companies, not like publishers. And this is why. So, as I described, the internet and the advent of research platforms opened up a lot of doors for changing in new business models. And it also made older business models less profitable, right? So, whereas it used to be that these companies profited by selling paper versions of raw data, right? They sold books. They digitized all of those materials and they were able to sell CD-ROMs with all of, United States case law or, the entirety of a journal. And then they were able to sell that data. So that was data as a service. Hey, if you pay us, we'll give you this information. We'll give you what you're looking for as far as books or journals or articles go. And as they were able to build internet platforms, they were able to create information as a service, right? I remember when Westlaw and Lexis went online and we had our first legal research platforms. That shows you how old I am. Um, but the companies, when they were able to use databases and make it so that if you had a password, you could log onto their systems so they could update the systems and move things around very easily, they could sort things in a way where you could search them, right? You could, if you were looking for all of the law about First Amendment and libraries, you could put those search terms into a search bar and then like magically the cases that were relevant would pop up in the search results. That's amazing, right? That I remember when that felt miraculous. And that was information as a service, right? That middle band in this triangle. So where we are now is um, scientists and technologists have built machine learning systems, right? They've built systems, these algorithms, where if you run data through the algorithms, you can get predictions about what might happen in the future. How will this judge see this case based on how they've seen other cases, based on how that particular court system has viewed the cases, right? Based on legal precedent, based on news stories, or what kind of technology is going to be the most profitable in 10 years from now based on the science that's going on right now in colleges and universities, right? Those kind of predictions are things we can guess about. And on a personal level, who is most likely to default on their loan, right? If I'm a bank, who's most likely to get COVID based on where they live and what their demographics are? Right? So they sell these predictions, whether they're correct or not, we'll get to in a little while. They also sell prescriptions. They tell you what to do, right? You should choose this grant. You should fund this grant because this is going to be the most lucrative grant. You should invest in this stock, right? You should wear a mask because there is a high amount of flu in your area. Um, and now there's something that's not included on this pyramid, which is generative analytics, right? That's artificial intelligence. The reason it's not on here is when I made these slides initially, when I made this pyramid a couple years ago, um, artificial intelligence didn't feel plausible, real, or useful, right? It was so wrong and clunky and silly that it wasn't worth mentioning. But now we have gotten to a place where where generative analytics are becoming more accurate, more realistic, and people are using them more and more. So if you want to put like a tiny triangle at the very top, you could put generative analytics because you better believe that a company that has tons of data and information will try to use it to build generative analytic products, right? To tell you what to do, to make like a chat GPT, or whatever other, services can monetize that kind of information. Because remember, these are for-profit companies. They're not like an open access mission. They're doing this for profit. And the types of information at the top, predictive analytics, prescriptive analytics, and generative intelligence, those are the most profitable because they create something new and proprietary and unique. You can only make these predictions, these prescriptions, these things if you have the raw data at the bottom, right? And there are only a few companies that have, I don't know, the entire corpus of US law or every Elsevier journal ever made, right? Only a few companies have that. So they have the unique power to sell that stuff and then sell the research platform, sell access to that, and then also sell prescriptions and predictions based on that data. Like, wow, they can not just, I used to call it double dipping, right? They can sell the information and then they can sell a prediction about that information. Now it's like almost triple dipping, right? They can sell the information, they can sell the research platforms and the predictive analytics, and they can also sell something generative that you can write a brief for a court, maybe it could generate that for you based on what the judge in question loves to hear, right? And the best arguments. So that is how the value of these systems work, and that also kind of demonstrates why they were so quickly adopted and entrenched. So this brings me back to Reed Elsevier, LexisNexis, Thomson Reuters, Clarivate, these companies that for years before machine learning was a thing, for years before generative analytics were a thing and generative intelligence, they had been stockpiling information types, right? Like they they probably couldn't have predicted all of this machine learning technology. Maybe they could have. Either way, they were well equipped to use it because they had more legal information than any other, these companies have more legal information than most companies. They have troves and troves, the entire corpus of US law, a lot of international law. They also have huge news archives. Look, Thomson Reuters has its own news service, right? It not only runs legal information platforms, data brokering industries stuff, but it also has its own news system, right? Its own news producer. Academic information like Clarivate and LexisNexis or Reed Elsevier LexisNexis have tons of academic information, as does Thomson Reuters. Um, and they have tons of financial information. They've been scraping um, SEC and other securities filings and corporate output for years, and they have all of this news related to business and financial markets, right? So they have tons of information, and they have the whole history of all of the court proceedings that all of these companies have gone through. What I didn't realize, and what was shocking to me, and what I wasn't allowed to talk about at AALL, was their personal information collections. What I didn't realize was that LexisNexis and Thomson Reuters are huge data brokers for the government and for private institutions that make big decisions about our lives. And I say this, I say I didn't know this as somebody who had been a law librarian for almost 20 years and had been using pretty exclusively Westlaw and LexisNexis. And I had no idea about the data brokering industry. So that's why I wrote the book. It's because nobody in my field knew about the data brokering industry. But, the reporters who wrote this story and saw their name on the list there, that was the first inkling that any of us had about all of their data brokering work, unless you were really in the business of using personal data. We kind of had an idea that LexisNexis did that because Their legal product did have some access to a little bit of personal data, but I don't know if anyone re recognized the magnitude of their data brokering work. So I differentiate data brokering from these other categories of data, and pick on only the blue one because generally when we say data brokering, we're talking about personal data. We're talking about data related to humans, um, and sometimes business entities. So this all was a surprise for me to me, and it took me a few years to really piece all of this together. It was kind of investigative and a little bit of detective work and a lot of learning things from people in other fields. So, um, because we're academics, I included this slide. This is an example. All of these companies, you probably recommend or recognize a lot of them. All of these companies are LexisNexis companies. Did you know that? If you didn't, you now do. Well, except for ProQuest, ProQuest and Clarivate. I'm sorry, they're separate. Trying to see if there's anything else. But the rest of them are now LexisNexis. Clarivate and ProQuest are a different company. So a couple years ago, Clarivate, which creates Web of Science, bought ProQuest, which is the largest learning management or LMS. I always forget this. I'm terrible at acronyms. Library management system. So like if you use a library catalog, it's probably a ProQuest catalog. Um, and now that is one really big company called Clarivate. So, oh, and Thomson Reuters Westlaw is Thomson Reuters, not LexisNexis. I couldn't see it. It was hiding uh under my screen. But most of these are LexisNexis companies. Some of them are Thomson Reuters, some of them are Clarivate. Let me move this. And I very quickly became most fascinated with Reed Elsevier LexisNexis because it is just so large and it engulfs so much of our informational ecosystem. And I just didn't know that. That doesn't say anything about the other companies, just worth noting. So yeah, these are all Reed Elsevier LexisNexis companies. Fascinating, right? And I still can't, I couldn't from the top of my head list all of the companies. There are just so many. So what does this, and then I started thinking about, practically what does this mean for us as academics, as people, as librarians, if we're librarians? Generally, it means we have to think about privacy because these companies that we do all of our academic work with are also selling our data to insurance companies, to government agencies. Um, you know, it's kind of interesting, something to keep in mind. Less academic and intellectual freedom. We don't know how we're being surveilled and tracked in these systems that we use to do our work as academics. Less control over academic assessment. So like H impact, and all the ways we measure how our research and work is doing, and whether we deserve tenure. Those kind of things are now kind of being put in the hands of these companies and their predictions and prescriptions. And we also have less choice. These companies are so big and they encompass so much of the academic ecosystem that we really, even if we don't like that they're selling tons of data to ICE, we really don't have a lot of choice, right? That's the problem of a monopoly or a duopoly, right? Reduced choices for consumers and consumers kind of being put in situations that maybe they don't want to be in, but they don't really have any other choice about. So, how can these companies pose these types of risk? Um, Data analytics. So I first would describe what data analytics are. I'm just going to kind of brush through these. I feel like this was more relevant before we all got into a data analytics world where we all know this now. But data analytics is when data is extracting, or is when we extract meaning from data sets, collections of data, collections of information, and we create models that will do that very quickly. Here are some examples of data analytics products: academic metrics, COVID-19 predictions, stock market predictions, and predictive policing systems. Not all of these are bad, not all of these are good. Um, what's good to some people may be bad to others. I am not a person who thinks that all technology is bad or all data analytics are bad. I just think that we need to consider whether they're good or bad and be critical about how they're implemented and whether we should be implementing them at all. So that is that's that. Yeah, if you want to know more about data analytics, we can have that conversation. So this is how these systems are advertised, kind of these perfect magical technology, wonderment systems that give you instant answer and everything's beautiful. This is how I see them now that I've been researching them for a really long time. Um, so the reason I use the Play-Doh extruder as kind of my example is that I think that it highlights kind of the two issues with data analytics. It is that the data sets that go into the system are imperfect, and oftentimes the algorithms are also imperfect and spit out bad results. So we're playing with data sets that are biased, that, if you're dealing with a data set for a policing product, oftentimes those data sets are collected by police. Police Policing bias is real. The data overwhelmingly reflects certain communities, certain types of people. That data set's not the best data set probably to use for policing and predicting who might commit a crime, right? Similarly, algorithms are created by humans. Most of those humans are certain types of humans. They're digital, they're engineers. A lot of them work in like Silicon Valley type of situations. They're not representative of everyone. And whether they are aware of it or not, their biases are baked into the systems that they build, right? Um, so one big example after 9/11, there were a couple of kind of at-home data analytics people. This was before the days of these big gigantic companies, and they built algorithms to try to figure out who the people who committed the 9/11 terror acts were, and then who was associated with them. How do you think they built those systems? Do you think that those systems were, those systems were very biased, and I think if we look at them through the lens of algorithmic bias, we would probably be very critical about implementing them today. So, yeah, the reality is that these systems are not perfect. They make mistakes. Nobody really quite understands how they generate the hot list that they do, how they generate the responses they do. And one of my favorite things about this extruder idea is that the way Relics makes their model look like is an extruder, right? So on the left-hand side, you have the Play-Doh, you have the clay. It's all of the different types of data that go into their system. Public records, proprietary data, which is probably like case law, their news archives, their financial data databases, news articles, contributory databases, and various records, their entire trove of information. And then it goes through the extruder. It's very unclear what happens in the middle. There are so many things layered into their algorithms that they don't even know how they work. And then that's true of most high-tech algorithms, like very complex algorithms. It's not clear exactly how they work. But what they say is through the system, the content volume is decreased and the content quality is increased. So something happens in there. And then they spit out those proprietary products, right? They spit out predictions, prescriptions, link analysis. So they can link things together, they can cluster them, they can do complex analyses. Now they can even do generative, types of work. So that I just extruder. Um, so um, so this is I'm going to show you in the last few minutes a little bit about their data brokering side because I think we're all pretty familiar with their academic and research platforms. Like we use them if we're all in academia, we use them all the time. They have this system, LexisNexis data broker products provide public records data, and they assign every person with something called a Lex ID. So that's like a universal identifier for you as a human. And what they do is they give you some sort of alphanumeric code that represents you, and then everything that comes in that's related to you gets linked to that, gets kind of thrown in your dossier, gets thrown in, your universal identifier. So they can filter tons of data through that system. I'll show you in a moment, like a fire hose of data that's constantly coming in, billions and billions of data points that they just sift about all of us. They can alert a system when something about you changes. So let's say you get a speeding ticket, they could instantly ping your insurance company if your insurance company is a customer. If one of your credit cards has an issue or you are late on rent or something. And if your banking system is a customer, they could notify your banking system immediately, right? They can do that kind of updating and do it very quickly. They can identify people who do not want to be identified. Thomson Reuters in one of their ads called it making the invisible visible. So, like, let's say you are the victim of domestic violence and you want to stay off of the radar, they can find you and identify you and find your data dossier and link you all right up. They can use visualizing and mapping tools so they can know where you are, where you tend to go, who you associate with at those places. They can make hot lists so that predictive analytics, like who are the top people who are likely to do X, Y, or Z in this geographic area. And they share information, especially with law enforcement and government agencies. And they even create systems that allow those law enforcement agencies to communicate with each other and share data with each other. So, and this is what a the Lex ID system looks like. Your Lex ID is your universal identifier. They can use it. You notice they can connect your universal identifier, to all of those things in that little circle in the middle. So information about where you live, geographically where you are, your automobile stuff, stuff from your phone, stuff from your credit card, your spending using, court records, public records, biometric data, and then geospatial data related to you. And then they can connect you to other people and other entities. Um, and they have at least this is now like 5 years old. At that time, they had 283 million US customer identities. So that was how many Lex IDs they have. I promise you they have more now. And back in the day, they had 78 billion records. They have more now. They get their data sources from over 10,000 um, types of data. And I'm not picking on Lexus here. They just had the prettiest imaging. Thomson Reuters is the same. They're not alone. There are a few others that are as big as them. So there are a few data brokers, but most of them aren't also ingrained into our academic lives. Something to think about. Um, so what are these companies selling? I'll just show you this before we go to some Q&A. LexisNexis has a virtual crime center and it collects all of these data points from all of these law enforcement agencies and sells it to the government. They sell not just to law enforcement agencies, but to 70% of local government and almost 80% of federal agencies in the United States. They sell data to landlords who use to tenant screening companies that are used by landlords to decide if you are an eviction risk. Um, so they'll assess you that way. If you are wrongfully assessed by the tenant screening company, you might get put on a blacklist where you can't rent an apartment or a place to live. Rough. This article is about that. Healthcare systems to assess how much you should be paying in your healthcare insurance. Um, Auto insurance and like your banking systems. And if they make a mistake, so if there's a bad piece of data in your dossier, which is not unlikely, you could be assessed like an insurance premium that is way too high. People in this article even got locked out of their banking accounts because of incorrect information in their system, and correcting it was really, really hard because LexisNexis does not correct information in your data dossier. You have to go downstream, figure out which of the 10,000 plus sources the data came from, and correct it there. And so this all raises the questions about where our research data goes. And we're not sure, but we have no choice but to use the research ecosystems that they provide because they're monopolies and we have to use them. And keep in mind that will, they're under no requirement to ever expunge our research data, right? They can keep it for as long as they want, and our data is very valuable. So I would imagine that they're not in any hurry to throw away the data that we give them. And they can change their mind or find a way to use it whenever they want. Yeah, so that's kind of that's where my research left off because to be continued, right? I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can have a conversation. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Sarah. That was wonderful. So, folks, if you're in the audience and you have questions or comments, what you can do is pop them into the Q&A or the chat, and I'll just read them out in case anyone's just listening, and I'll wait and see if we have any that pop up. But I have some questions too. Could you say a little bit more about the cross-market sharing of these data? You mentioned ICE, and you mentioned some policing agencies, but can you just expand on the scope of criminal justice agency purchasing of these tools?
So, yeah, I can't speak for Canada. I have to imagine it's pretty similar because I think your policing infrastructure is also, digitally sophisticated. I know that in the United States, thousands of police agencies, local, state, federal, use LexisNexis and Thomson Reuters services. And so, FBI, CIA, all of the big government agencies, and even the little ones, like the IRS uses, to track mail fraud or to try to figure out mail fraud situations. And there's even so LexisNexis even works with governments, school systems, healthcare systems. You know how now when like let's say you want to access your bank account and you call an 800 number and they ask you a few questions, they're like, what was your mom's maiden name? What kind of car did you drive? And you never told them, right? You never told them any of it. But they ask the question and then suddenly you're allowed to access your account. Yeah, so that's data brokering in action too. So they also do a lot. They sell these verification services, right? Like we'll help make sure that nobody's committing fraud, nobody's trying to use your government account, access your government information, your academic information that's not you, right? And like I said, I some of this is could be considered ethically ambiguous. Like, yeah, it's pretty cool that nobody can steal your ID that way. But at what cost and what safeguards are on those services, right? Um, and right now, at least in the US, it's completely unregulated. I'm not aware of any like huge, amazing, sophisticated regulation in Canada either, but that's kind of where we are. And 5 years ago, I would have said, oh, well, law enforcement agencies are definitely using it. I can't speak to anything else. Everybody's using it now.
Yeah, yeah. That also leads into another question I had. So in the United States, you have bodies that could potentially regulate data brokers. You have Federal Trade Commission and you have Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Well, you have it now. We'll see if you have it in like a month. Uh, I believe the CFPB put out a statement in like November saying they have an intention to regulate data brokers, and then, you know, maybe that's why Musk and Trump are looking at axing that agency. So what are the possibilities of regulating data brokers, given that these two pretty powerful agencies have not done so to this point?
Yeah, and that's a great question because it really could go either way. We were kind of at this point where there's a it- we were really at a place where we were on the verge of addressing the issue. Yeah, Consumer Finance Protection Bureau was set to do, some amount of safeguarding this industry. And Federal Trade Commission obviously was doing a lot of work on digital privacy and really focusing on data brokers. That obviously we are not there anymore. One thing I always like to point out is in the United States, we have a law called the Privacy Act of 1974, which is actually meant to put safeguards on government collections of personal data. And what we never depended on was that the data wouldn't be collected by the government. So this law works great when like the Social Security Administration is collecting information about us for Social Security purposes or the IRS, the Tax and Revenue Service. Like that those systems have safeguards where they have to tell us when they're collecting data. They can only collect data for a very narrow purpose and they can't share it with other agencies. Like there are rules in place for data that is collected by the government. The problem is if they use these companies, if they just buy subscriptions to these databases and these products, they can get around all of those laws, right? Just like they can thwart the Fourth Amendment. In the United States, you have to have a warrant if you are going to conduct a search or seizure, right? If you're going to go look at somebody's data set, you have to have a reason. You have to go to court and say, here's why I think we should be able to do it. And then the judge has to say, okay, I agree with you. If you just have a subscription to LexisNexis, you don't have to get a warrant, right? So the government can use these third-party systems to get around whatever safeguards do exist. And I think that's part of what makes them appealing, unfortunately, to government entities. And I will say, like, I was curious because data privacy actually, at the end of the day, is kind of a bipartisan issue. Nobody likes to be creeped out about where their data is going. Everybody thinks it's creepy, right? Like, I went to Congress to talk about this topic a couple of years ago, and it was because they were looking for a bipartisan topic, right? And this is one. Nobody likes being having their data collected. It's gross and creepy, and it feels like a violation of liberties. However, it does seem like the current administration is very keen to use these types of services. Um, yeah, they like, yeah, it does seem like we were kind of going this way and that we're going. We've just gone the other direction.
Yeah. Uh, it's kind of the similar situation in Canada. We have federal privacy laws that are kind of elaborate. They apply to public bodies and private bodies, but there's a kind of loophole. And privacy commissioners have said, hey, we're not sure if data brokers are complying. That's kind of like putting it mildly or, an understatement. I'm wondering, in that kind of context, what should people think about doing with their data if we know privacy laws are not really working? And there's also this idea of radical secrecy or like hiding and disguising, but it doesn't necessarily work if you need to be on these platforms all the time. So what kind of advice would you give to people in this era of pervasive information collection and data brokering?
It's really, really tough. Like I used to give this talk to my students, and then there would just be this moment where they'd be like, well, what are we gonna like, and I would say, I'm not telling you to throw your computer in the ocean, right? I'm not telling you it's not your fault. I think people we use phrases like digital hygiene, and like, oh, well, it's up to you. You have to not use Facebook or throw your, have you been clearing your cache? Like, this idea puts the onus of our digital protection on us when it's really these other companies that are exploiting and being very invasive about our data. Like, it's not our fault. We live in this digital world. These digital tools are in some ways amazing, right? Like, I don't want to tell you not to use social media. Social media is how we communicate nowadays. What, you're going to cut yourself out of society completely? No. So I always just say, like, have to force we have to force the vision of the systems that we want to exist in the world, right? We should be able to use these systems and enjoy the benefits that they provide, but we should also be guaranteed a certain modicum of protection, right? And I saw somebody ask about consent in the chat, right? Modern data privacy is different than physical privacy of the past, right? Now, when we talk about privacy now, we talk about transparency, so knowing about how our data is being used, and consent, only using our data in ways that we say it is okay to use our data, right? And not false consent of like clicking I agree because you have to access something, but consent that you really give, that you are really okay with the parameters because you feel confident that Facebook's not going to sell your data, or like that weather app's not going to give your data to the cops or whatever. Like, you have to be comfortable with the way your data is being used. And that is something that we don't have right now, but that's the kind of stuff that we have to try try to get. And I don't see companies super willing to do this, so I always say like government intervention is probably how that's going to happen. But unfortunately, also one thing I know, this is true in the US, we don't usually take action until there's a tipping point, until something so bad happens that we have no choice but to take action. So I feel like it will probably be the same with this. There until the world gives us a reason, we might not do these things.
Yeah. And maybe, especially not in the next 2 years in the US, maybe things will change after 2 years. Thanks for answering Dari's question about consent and privacy in the chat. Question from Bill in the chat. Does the existence of data brokers make government actions like the UK's request for a backdoor in Apple products redundant? And does the cozy relationship between tech companies, surveillance capitalists, and government help explain the ways that all these companies are falling in line for the Trump administration?
I mean, yes, yes, yes. The Apple thing is interesting. And I'll be clear, there's some companies that I don't research as much, that I know less about. But yeah, so your data dossier with data brokers is so robust that I don't know what other kind of data they would need, but I do think that I do think that Apple phones do have a certain layer of protection that maybe if you need something that's a particular there might be things that you can get. I'm not going to say for sure that there are things that you can get from Apple phones unless you have some sort of access. So there might be things that are very particular to your phone. I don't know, maybe things that you like personal notes that you don't transmit or something that are protected, but it would have to be data that is Apple data on Apple apps, like third-party apps. No, right? But maybe there are certain things that are particularly held by Apple that Apple does not give to data brokers. Because not all companies provide data directly to data brokers. There are all these complicated data schemes, and not all of them involve directly selling data to data brokers. But one thing to keep in mind is a lot of companies share anonymized data. So that is data that has been scraped of identifying context. However, data brokers have so much other data about you that is very easy to de-anonymize anonymized data. It is very easy to figure out who does what and whose data belongs to who. So take that for what it's worth.
Um, I was going to ask a question. I've been seeing popping up in like, I don't know, I think they're YouTube commercials and other places. I don't know if they're just focusing on me or if everybody's getting them. There's these companies now selling like scrubbing services, companies that say, we will scrub your data broker profile. We'll go there. Like you mentioned, you can't just contact these entities and tell them, get rid of my Lex ID. It's not going to happen. You have to work all the way through them all. But there's these companies saying they can do it. What do you think of that? Is it kind of like an impossible task, or is it a genuinely interesting initiative?
Okay, so that's interesting to me because so California has a great, has not, I'm not gonna say great. No, there's no great. I mean, they have the strongest in the US comprehensive data privacy law. And under that law, data companies have to do things that they don't have to do in other contexts, and in other jurisdictions. So I could see, I don't know, that's really tough. Because there could be a company operating somewhere where you are allowed to, you do have the right to be the right to be forgotten. You also have the right to be forgiven, but you have the right to be forgotten. And if you could go to a jurisdiction that has that right and then demand it of somebody who's not there, I don't know. That's an interesting business model because there are some places where you are in some sort of data privacy law or regulation granted the right to request that your data be destroyed, be removed, not be collected anymore. One thing to keep in mind with these data brokers is let's say you go and you erase your entire data dossier and then you log on to something. There's your new data dossier. It's kind of whack-a-mole because if you are still participating in a digital world, even after your data has been erased, they can just start a new one. I don't know. That's an interesting idea
Yeah,
though.
that's kind of what I was thinking too, in terms of the practicalities of it. There's copies of copies of copies of these data sets. So you could get it off the books at one or two places, but then it's just going to be backfilled the next time they make a purchase of of the data set, and the same inaccuracies, the same problems in the data sets will still be there.
Yeah. Yeah, especially because there are so many sources. Like even if you scrub your LexisNexis data set, all the hundreds of other places that collect your data will still keep it. And some of those are public record sources. So, you're yeah, and companies that not only are under no obligation to erase your data, but it's guaranteed that they're going to keep it forever. They're like companies that collect your credit history, right? You can't nobody's going to let you erase that.
The credit history one is really scary for people because if you have inaccurate credit stuff, it's like good luck making uh, some purchases that you really have to make in your life, or getting a line of credit, or all those kinds of things. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to ask another question, maybe time for one or two more questions if people in the audience have a question. At the American Library Association's Office for Intellectual Freedom, can you say a little bit more about the work you do and kind of what's on your radar there? I know we have some librarians in the audience who are interested in your work just generally.
Yeah, it's interesting because we do so privacy is inherent in intellectual freedom. And the reason I became drawn to the concept of intellectual freedom, the work of intellectual freedom, is because part of part of being able to explore materials and learn about new things and read in a library, do and even digitally, like do a Google search or do any sort of exploration is the idea that when you do that, you are not going to be surveilled, especially by the government, but by anybody. You aren't going to be humiliated. You aren't, your search terms aren't going to be put on a billboard in a city square. Like that kind of privacy is crucial to not chilling your research habits and your research ideas and your creative ideas and your generative ideas, right? So that is where I came to intellectual freedom. Right now in the United States, it's probably similar in Canada, frankly, I don't know, but in the United States, we really have been focusing on censorship issues because that has been there's been just an onslaught of censorship problems, threats to certain types of materials, even now through executive order, through presidential office. So we've been dealing a lot with that. However, as far as privacy goes, the thing that we have been thinking about a lot are these vendors with their digital access and kind of e-resources, electronic and digital resources, and making sure that library users can access those without their data being collected and sold to data brokers, tracked, etc. That's one of our concerns. And then also AI, learning more about how the advent of generative technologies affects all of our privacy as library users, as researchers, both as content creators, but then also as, people who might be using those systems.
So we got one more question from Bill, and then I have one other question about AI. So Bill's question, is there any hope coming from the EU? They've got like this harmonized privacy legislation that's supposed to be addressing data brokering and AI. They seem to care about privacy. Perhaps uh, this legal movement might be emulated elsewhere. What do you think?
I mean, that was always my goal. Yeah, I mean, that so their, GDPR is kind of the best game we have going. As far as privacy goes, it's comprehensive. It covers a bunch of different, covers a lot of different jurisdictions. There's an enforcement mechanism. There are these courts that'll hear these cases. So, their policies are a little, they're a little company, they're they try to balance the interests between being able to commercialize data and also being able to protect people, which that that could be seen as a reasonable goal, being able to take advantage of all the data that while also putting safeguards on it. However, their laws stop short of requiring companies to delete data, as far as I know, unless there is if there's a right to be forgotten, you might be able to get your data erased. However, there are a lot of really positive safeguards that are in place through the GDPR. And notice the types of data brokering that happen in the US haven't flourished in Europe in the same way. And I suspect that's because the cost and the difficulty of doing that kind of business in Europe because of GDPR and similar regulations makes it less commercially viable, right? So even if you put in regulations that don't stop the behavior completely, if you make them more complicated, like giving people the right to be forgotten, requiring certain layers of consent before collecting, using, selling data, there might become so much friction in the processes of data brokering that it might make it really expensive and hard to implement.
Thank you. I just have one more question, and it's about what's happening in the US right now. Some really unprecedented experimental things. You've got Musk laying off all these folks, but also asking a bunch of other folks to email in job descriptions and what they're doing all the time. And I'm wondering what the relationship between that and generative AI is. Do you think that there are these some kind of like experiments in data collection within government to then train uh, with AI off of those emails to create a more automated federal government service?
I mean, I am not in the government, so I can only speculate. I can only say what I think the risks are of doing this kind of a thing. So, I mean, that's what I've heard. I guess we've all we if we've read the news, there's a good chance we've heard whisperings of that. And I think people have also raised the concerns around these things. What first, all of this type of data collection goes directly against the Privacy Act of 1974, that privacy law that I talked about earlier, right? That we have laws that make this type of data breach, data collection, data use illegal. Like it is not allowed. Um, and also I think it's really interesting that we aren't considering the security risks of collecting this kind of data in a totally unprotected way to use in an experimental way. This data strikes me as data that maybe, especially when collected in aggregate, would be pretty sensitive for any government to collect. If I saw another country collecting all of this data about what every federal employee was doing, I would say, wow, that's pretty foolish from a data security standpoint. Um, so I think that that's a concern that for some reason is not being taken into account. And then, like we said, so the thing about utilizing AI that we have to keep in mind is remember the Play-Doh fun factory, right? It's not these systems we all know are rife with errors, biases. We don't quite know how they work. The data sets are like people are just self-reporting and then like I know a lot of people are sending in joke reporting and using the email address and putting in all sorts of ridiculous things. Like what what exactly like what kind of really great intelligent answers are we going to get from doing any sort of data analysis on these emails and making decisions based on these emails? It just seems like a fool's game when it comes to any sort of accuracy and efficiency and also data. It just seems like a big data security issue that violates privacy laws and administrative procedure laws and all sorts of other rules that Congress has created over a long time. Like it's basically Congress made all these laws, and now this this I don't person, not somebody who was elected to government like Congress, is just going over and doing whatever they want, which is problematic in a number of ways.
Yeah, I think that it's pretty bizarre how they're just sidestepping all the laws that do exist, and it's worth pondering what are they really trying to do with that information. And as you say, given what we know about the Play-Doh extrusion kind of model, even if they were trying to create an automated public service, it probably it wouldn't work that well. Like there'd be all kinds of inaccuracies. Maybe that is ultimately what the Trump side of the equation wants, because then it would lead to more privatization of these kinds of things when they're doomed to failure. Anyway, things that are happening right now that your research definitely connects to. And thank you so much for doing this really amazing exploration of what data brokers and these uh, companies that on the surface of things are academic, but are much more than that are doing.
One thing I totally forgot this until this moment. One thing to note, so Marjorie Taylor Greene is an American legislator in Congress, and I don't know who organized it. There was a hearing about government efficiency and Doge, and I think the first speaker at that hearing, the first person that provided testimony was the CEO of LexisNexis. Just putting that out there for whatever it's worth. So yeah, I do think that these systems are I do think that people are planning on using these systems in order to enact whatever efficiency plans come into play.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think we had lots of good questions from the audience and lots of people singing your praises and giving you thanks in the chat. Thanks everyone in the audience for being here. Thanks so much to Sarah Lamdan, our featured speaker, for your presentation and all the amazing work that you do. And if anyone wants to reach out to Sarah, you can uh, find Sarah at the American Library Association, the Office for Intellectual Freedom there. And definitely, if you haven't already, pick up Data Cartels and learn more. So thank you again, everybody. Thanks, Sarah.
Bye.
Bye-bye. And Evan, Media Services, thanks to you too. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.